Hello and welcome back to the 8-Bit Guy. This is going to be a fun little episode today. It's going to be about these little mini tabletop arcades. Now, believe it or not, I actually did not know these existed. Somehow they just passed me right on by. It wasn't until about a year ago when I was visiting the National Video Game Museum here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and they had one of the Miss Pac-Man units out on display, and you could actually walk up and play it. And so that was the first time I've actually seen one of these. And I've got 3 of them here. Now, this first one was donated to me almost a year ago by one of my fans. And it works, but it's got some problems, and I'm going to see if I can fix it. And then I picked this guy up at a local gaming convention, and it works, but it needs some serious restoration work. So I'm going to try to do that. And then I bought this one on eBay, and it actually seems to work fine. There's nothing wrong with it, so I'll just show you that one. And then I'm going to show you some of the newer models that they sell these days, and we'll see how they compare to the older models from the 80s. So let's dig in. So let's take a closer look at this Coleco Pac-Man game. All of these older units require 4 C-cell batteries. That's because their vacuum fluorescent screens are quite the energy hog. So one of the problems this unit has is that sometimes it just won't turn on. Now when it does turn on, the screen has some issues. When you power the game on, you can select 4 different modes, including 2 different styles of playing along with the 2-player mode. And if you press the joystick down, it goes into demo mode. And one thing you might notice when looking at this is that there's a lot of ghosting on the screen, no pun intended. If you look at the bottom row especially, you'll see faint images of things that aren't supposed to be there, and they tend to follow what's going on in the rest of the screen. Even though I've never worked on a VFD screen, my first guess is a capacitor problem, based on similar issues with LCD and LED screens I've worked on. The second thing you might notice is that the scoreboard's missing. It's totally not lit up at all, but it should be at the top of the screen. Well, I guess it's time to take this thing apart. There are just a few screws on the bottom to remove, and it comes apart easily. Wow, that is really weird looking. I guess that's the speaker, but I've never seen one like that before. I'm going to try to twist it and see if it'll come out. Wow, look at that. It's actually just a tiny piezo speaker, but they're using the cone to amplify its sound. I've never seen anything like that before. Well, I guess I'm going to have to desolder these wires if I plan to work on it any further. But I think I can already see the source of the problem with this thing. Check out all of that corrosion. I suspect this leak from the battery, but I think the unit would have had to have been stored upside down for that to have happened. Anyway, let's get these wires desoldered. Okay, so there are just 3 screws holding down the logic board, so I'll take those out and then we'll see how the screen's hooked up. Interesting, the screen is actually mounted right on the board. I wasn't expecting that, but I guess it makes sense. Without the dark filter covering the screen, you can see all of the possible positions of the characters on the screen. It appears to be covered with a red color filter on the bottom part as well. You can clearly see the scoreboard readout on the top, so we need to get that working. The screen on this thing is a vacuum fluorescent display, and it works very similar to the screen here in the Speak and Spell, except the different segments that can light up are not used to create numbers and letters. If all the segments were lit up at once, it would look like this. The ghosts actually contain a little mini Pac-Man and a pellet. When the power pellets are eaten and the ghosts run, they can't turn blue like in the original game, so instead they turn hollow like this. And you might wonder why they use this sort of screen. Well, at the time, the only other choices would have been a CRT, which would have been very long and would have likely not fit in the machine. They might have been able to use a clever CRT design like these old Sony Watchmans, which use an inventive design to show the image out the side of the CRT instead. But keep in mind that these units sold for around $60 back in the 1980s, and even if they had managed to fit a CRT display in here, they would have also needed to include a video graphics chip and a whole slew of other components to drive that CRT, which would have driven the cost up by an order of magnitude. Now, in theory, they could have also used LCD screens, but at that time, LCDs were primarily just reflective in nature, and so they were not backlit. And so you wouldn't have been able to use this hood design with the arcade, pretty much changing the entire appearance of how the arcade would look. Anyway, so back to repairing this. I decided to try alcohol on the corrosion for my first attempt to clean it. I scrubbed, and while I did see some improvement, it wasn't much. Next I tried some of this deoxit. Tried several times, including scrubbing that around on there. So my efforts so far have been mildly successful. My next attempt was baking soda. I've had good luck with this in the past for removing corrosion from copper or silver. Well, I've managed to remove most of the buildup, but these traces still look terrible. And to make matters worse, I found another spot of corrosion over here that I'll need to work on. One thing I was curious about was how many of these traces still have continuity and how many I'm going to have to patch with wires. To my surprise, I actually couldn't find a single trace that was broken. And I mean, that's really surprising considering how these traces look. So I decided to reconnect the battery compartment so I could do some further testing. One thing I noticed right away is that the ghosting was gone. I think the corrosion was actually conducting some power between the traces. Of course, it's hard to tell 100% since I don't have the dark filter over the screen right now. The scoreboard is still not working though. So I went back to continuity testing. I was sure there must be a trace that's bad somewhere. However, I still couldn't find any problem. I was really mystified as to what could be wrong, and to make matters worse, I was unable to locate a schematic diagram for this board. So I decided to make my own. I started with the screen, and I created a little graphic to represent the pins on the screen, and started poking around with my meter to figure out where they went. I found the ground pretty quickly. Actually, I found 2 of them. I figured I'd just write enough stuff down. My plan was, once I figured out what all of the pins did on the screen, I could try to use a wire to manually light up the scoreboard segment and verify that those segments work, and then trace those wires back to the chip and see if there were any problems along the way. Fortunately, some of the pins on the screen I could actually see if I held at the right angle, and I had determined that the screen was set up like a matrix, with each row having a pin, while some of the other pins were vertical controls. The CPU cycles through these very quickly to create a persistence of vision so that it looks solid to our eyes, much like a CRT works. And it turns out I'm a bonehead in this case. Watch this. I've been playing the game in demo mode, but I discovered by accident that if I start the game in actual game mode, the scoreboard lights up just fine. So it turns out the game was doing exactly what it was designed to do. So that being the case, I decided to just put it back together. It did need a little cleaning, but nothing severe. So let's test it again. Notice this weird flicker pattern? You can't see this with your eyes. This is my camera being just slightly out of sync with the matrix refresh. I'm going to turn the light out in the room, which will cause the camera to increase its exposure time, and yep, sure enough, it looks fine now. You can still see a faint hint of the refresh. So playing the game, I can see that the scoreboard is definitely working fine. I can also see that the ghosting effect that was present at the bottom is now gone. Removing that corrosion must have been all that was needed. So, I think I can do without the schematic. Let's focus on this Donkey Kong unit now. One problem is this yucky stuff on the side here. Not sure what that is. The other problem is the decals. They're faded and peeling off. Some of these are just hanging on by a thread. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and pull this one off right now. I think I can make use of the experience I gained relabeling some of my cartridge games. The way I'm going to do this is first to put the existing decal in my scanner and get a color scan of it. So this gives me a base outline to work with. But if you look at the image up close, it's grainy and just not a very clean drawing. What I do next is use the fill tool and just fill all of the color areas with white. What the goal is here is to turn this into essentially a black and white line drawing. People ask what program I use. Well, this is a nearly 20-year-old copy of PaintShop Pro, and I've been using this software for just about 20 years, and I'm really good with it, and it does everything I need. It still works fine on modern versions of Windows. So I've just not had any incentive to learn to use a more modern paint program. Okay, once I have all the areas turned white, I reduce the image down to a 2-color monochrome image like this. And here's where most of the work actually begins. I have to go over and around every line and clean up all of the stray pixels by hand. And this process can take anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. I want these lines to look really nice and neat. And once I'm done with that, I convert it to a 16-color image and start filling in colors. And I try to match the original label as closely as possible. I've also decided to add a little something here in the bottom. A lot of people had an aneurysm when they saw that I recreated labels for my cartridges, so on this one I'm going to add some fine text at the bottom that says it is a reproduction label. I doubt anyone will notice this text unless they're outright looking for it, so I don't think it'll degrade the appearance of my game. Alright, next thing to do is print it out on my laser printer. Now I'm going to laminate it. I used packing tape on my cartridges, but these labels are too big. Regular laminations won't really work for this, but these here are self-stick sheets. So these sheets are essentially like a huge piece of packing tape. This is actually my first time to try these, so I'm as curious as anyone as to how they'll work out. I don't really need the whole sheet, so I'll cut it in half. Well, here we go. Let's see how this works. Well, I think that's going to work out just fine. Time to cut it out with some scissors. I suppose I should do a little test fit here, and yeah, I think it's going to fit just fine. Of course, I'll need to clean off all this old adhesive residue first. WD-40 is my go-to product for that. I'll just kind of rub that around and make sure the whole side is coated, and I'll let that sit for a few minutes. Okay, then I'll come back and wipe that off. I always use Windex to remove any residual WD-40 from the surface, and here's the result. It is clean and ready for a new decal. I guess I'd better remove the rest of these decals as well. And I used the same technique to recreate these decals. I just scanned them and cleaned them right up next to each other. Alright, so I've got all the decals removed except for the one around the controls, as that one seems fine. However, I do need to turn my attention to whatever this stuff is. I'm going to try some alcohol on it first. Well, after scrubbing for several minutes, I think it did round about nothing. So I'll try some WD-40, and I'll see if that will soften it up some. Okay, I let that sit for about an hour, so let's see what that did. And apparently nothing. Unfortunately, despite my best efforts, I got WD-40 under this decal, and so now it's coming off. So I guess I'd better go ahead and recreate that one as well. Alright, so after another hour of work, here's the result, and you can compare it to the original. I'll go ahead and laminate this one too. Now, I can cut the main decal out with scissors, but one thing that concerns me is that I have to cut round holes out of this, which is going to be a challenge. I'll come back to that in a minute, but for the moment I want to tackle this gunk some more. I decided to try baking soda next, and after another 20 minutes of scrubbing, it had no effect. I also tried a variety of other chemicals behind the scenes, including a magic eraser. Nothing worked. So I've given up on a chemical solution at this point, and I'm going to use a knife to mechanically remove this stuff. This wasn't my first choice. I know it will affect the texture of the plastic, but at this point anything will look better. Now, I've done this sort of thing before with epoxy from metal asset tags and things like that, and the key is to try to scrape as little away as possible, and by holding the knife like this, I can avoid any deep scratches. I was surprised how stubborn this stuff was, even with a knife. At first, I thought this was some sort of glue or epoxy that had been spilled on here, but one thing I began to realize is that even after scraping away many layers of plastic, the discoloration remained. So at this point, I don't have any idea what was spilled on here, but whatever it was affected the plastic deep down. I worked on this for a while and never got it perfect, but it is certainly better. Let me clean up the adhesive residue on here right quick, and then take a look. Like I said, it's not perfect, but it looks better. Now it's time to tackle these holes. I'm going to use a razor knife and a cutting board and try to slowly and carefully cut the hole out. This is very delicate because if I cut too little, it won't fit correctly. And if I cut too much, the label's ruined and I'll have to start all over again. So in cases like this, it's better to take your time and go slowly. Okay, so here's what I've got so far. Let's get the last one. Alright, so there we have it. I guess I better try a test fit on the game, and okay, seems to fit fine. Alright, so the next thing I need to do is take these labels that I've created and then use the spray adhesive and spray it on the plastic and then stick the labels on there. Now, when I did the cartridge restoration video a while back where I relabeled it, a lot of people were asking, why didn't I use the spray and spray it on the label and then put the label on the plastic? They thought that would make a lot more sense. Well, it might. And I actually might try that here in a little bit, but there's two problems that could create. One problem is if you spray this stuff on, it's kind of liquidy when it first comes out of the spray bottle. And so if you get the liquid on here, it will seep through the paper and it'll show up on the other side underneath the laminate. And so I don't want that, because once you see that, it's the label's pretty much ruined. It's possible if I try to do a lighter spray from a further distance, then maybe I'll be able to do that. The second problem is, once you've coated this in the adhesive, there's really not any way to pick it up. Because when you pick it up, you've got to touch both sides of it. This thing is too flimsy to be able to really pick it up and work with it like this. And, I don't really want to touch the other side when it's sticky because I'm going to make the adhesive uneven and possibly mess it up. So, not to mention, I don't want the stuff on my fingers. So, I'm going to experiment here with some different ways of doing this because this one would be considerably more challenging to mask off than previous ones, but I think I can do it. So we'll see. Okay, so this is a test piece I made earlier, and I just used packing tape on it, mostly just to check for shape and color. Anyway, I won't be using this, so I'm going to test the spray adhesive on it. Hopefully if I hold the can further away and use a lighter coat, maybe it won't bleed through. Okay, well, so far so good. I think this may work. Alright, so here goes nothing. I'm going to try putting on this piece here first. First the spray. This stuff also needs about 15 seconds to dry up just a bit before applying it. Okay, so here goes. Okay, so far so good. I'm using the back of my fingers to rub this on because I got the glue on my fingertips and I don't want to spread that around on the top. And here's the finished product. I'm really pleased with the outcome of the new decals. I just wish I could have cleaned that gunk off a little better. So now I suppose I should show you the game itself. Again, this flickering is only visible on camera. I feel like this game is somewhat easier to play than the Pac-Man game for some reason. Anyway, there you have it. And I also promised to show you this Frogger game, which is in great shape already. This is actually my favorite of the three I have, mostly because the gameplay seems to feel more like the actual arcade. I think it's probably just because the way the game works, it was easier to design a system like this around it. Interestingly enough, this game looks quite a bit better in person. The camera actually picks up all of the segments that are not lit, even though in person they are very hard to see. I'm not sure why that is exactly. I suspect it has something to do with the filter used and the specific frequencies of light. So just take my word for it that in person there's no flicker and you can't see the non-lit segments. Okay, so I also promised to show you these more modern mini arcades. I've picked up quite a few of these. So what I want to do first is, since we've seen the original Pac-Man, I'm going to take a look at these two different versions of Pac-Man that are available today. Both of these are brand new and never been opened. Okay, this first one here is the cheaper of the two, and I think I picked this up at Toys R Us for like $15. Unfortunately, you have to destroy the package to get the game out. Alright, so here it is. This thing is almost too small to play it like a tabletop arcade. And you need to pull this tag out so that it'll stop operating in demo mode. So let's turn it on. Well, the music and sound effects sound like the original arcade rather than the old tabletop version. The screen is clearly a reflective LCD, but I have to admit, it's a lot more playable than the original Coleco version. And I think the reason has less to do with the screen type and more to do with how they've arranged the segments. You see, the little Pac-Man character is large and centered within the lines. The way they did the older one, he was very small and off-center, which was annoying. So the bottom line is, this is more playable than the original, but it feels cheap and doesn't seem nearly as collectible. So let's move on to the boxed version. I think this one cost me more like $40, but it was advertised as having a color screen, so I'm curious to see how it's different. At least I don't have to destroy the box on this one. However, this is interesting. Apparently you have to pull the tape off these things and then rotate them to release the game from the box. It also has this same little pull tab in the back. And here it is. This one's pretty cool looking. I could see having this on a shelf as a decoration or something. So let's try it out. There's a little bit of a flicker here on camera, again not visible in person. I like the colors. It actually makes it a lot easier on the eyes to be able to tell the difference between the walls, the pellets, the ghosts, etc. I'm not sure what sort of screen technology this is. At first I was tempted to say it's backlit LCD, but it could also be some form of LED. Either way, it does look a lot better than the original mini arcade, but yet it still has that nostalgic feel because it's still using a segmented display. So yeah, I think this one's pretty cool. I wanted to open the battery compartment and see what's in there. Okay, it looks like it just uses regular alkaline batteries, so you might want to remove these if you plan on storing these as a collectible, otherwise they'll wind up leaking all over the place. And the good news is you can put it back in the box if you want and it'll still look brand new. Let's move on to the Space Invaders. This is also of the cheap variety, and I think I paid $15 for this one too. So yeah, I'll have to rip the box open. Alright, so it uses a segmented display, but it actually works really well. The game seems very playable, yet definitely has that retro feel to it. The sound effects are more reminiscent of the original arcade, though. Okay, back to these boxed versions. This is Asteroids. So this is a nice looking little arcade. Let's try it out. Okay, so this appears to be a backlit segmented LCD of some sort. And yes, you can see all of the segments, even with the naked eye. Your ship seems confined to the center of the screen and can rotate around in a circle. The asteroids themselves look fine, but after playing this for a while, I just do not feel the game is very playable. Or maybe it just doesn't feel like Asteroids because of the weird motion of the ship. I mean, sure, staying in the center of the screen has always been a winning move in Asteroids, but when you turned your ship, it didn't spin around in a circle like this. So, yeah, I'm not impressed with this one. Also, the screen contrast is bad, probably the worst of all of them I've tried so far. Moving on to Q*bert. I'm going to be very interested to see how they accomplish the screen on this one. So here it is, very cute design. Let's power it on. This is a full dot matrix display. I don't know whether to be impressed or call them out as cheaters. Well, this version of the game seems very playable. In fact, the resemblance to the Nintendo version of this game is uncanny. That makes me wonder if they're using one of those Nintendo on a chip designs. The joystick is properly designed for Q*bert since it moves diagonally like it should. Well, let's move on and look at Frogger. If you remember, this was my favorite of the 3 original Coleco mini arcades that I had because I felt like it was the most playable. Let's see how the new one stacks up. Well, what do you know? It uses a full dot matrix display as well, and the game seems to play very well. The interesting thing is, it has a nostalgic feel, but it feels more like the original arcade than the mini arcade. Not that that's a problem, just unexpected. Okay, the last game we're going to look at today is Centipede. At this point, I'm half expecting it to be a dot matrix display as well. And indeed it is. Okay, so nothing I can really complain about on the display or the gameplay. But I wanted to take one of these dot matrix games apart and see what's inside. Interesting, it's more or less one giant epoxy blob, and I guess the screen is on the other side, but looking at this little board, a couple of things stood out to me. The first thing that caught my eye was this little chart that says Centipede and Q*bert on it. It mentions R4 and J1. Could this mean that both games are on the same board? I didn't feel like desoldering the resistor, but I thought I'd just try shorting J1 with a screwdriver and see what happens when I power on the game. And sure enough, my Centipede game has now become Q*bert. I was curious if I could play it, being the joystick is not oriented correctly for Q*bert. And it turns out I can, but it's not nearly as easy to play. Let's reset the game and see what happens. Okay, it reverts back to Centipede. Looking at this board, I can see a ton of little exposed solder pads, and I have to wonder what these are for. My guess is there are other features just waiting to be hacked, and I wouldn't even be surprised if there's a reprogrammable flash memory that you could access and possibly put your own games on here. Yeah, so I would not be surprised if one of you guys have already done some hacking around on one of these things. So if you figured out what those extra solder pads do, then send me a private message and I'll investigate it, and maybe I'll do a follow-up to this video in the future. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed seeing all of these mini arcades from both the past and the present. And also my camera died around halfway through the middle of filming this episode. I had to send it off to Panasonic for repair. So I used a different camera for the second half, so if you're wondering why maybe things look a little bit different, that's why. Anyway, got a lot of great content coming up, so stick around, and thanks for watching.